my precious little dragons, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you are having an absolutely lovely day. Today I am going to be reviewing The Island of Sea Women by Lisa C. This is the second Lisa C book that I read in 2020. Obviously by the time that you are watching this it is no longer 2020, but I did read both of those in my first introduction to Lisa C. I'm going to talk a little bit about the summary of Island of Sea Women, and then we can go ahead and get started into the review. So I forgot to do this the last couple book looks, but I'm going to go ahead and read the synopsis. Set largely on the Korean island of Jeju, The Island of Sea Women follows Nija and Young-suk, two girls from very different backgrounds, as they begin working in the sea with their village's all-female diving collective. Over many decades through the Japanese colonialism of the 1930s and 40s, World War II, the Korean War, and the era of cell phones and wetsuits for the women divers, Nija and Young-suk develop the closest of bonds. Nevertheless, their differences are impossible to ignore. Nija is the daughter of a Japanese collaborator, forever marking her, and Young-suk was born into a long line of Haenyeo and will inherit her mother's position leading the divers. After hundreds of dives and years of friendship, forces outside their control push their relationship to the breaking point. So that is the synopsis of The Island of Sea Women. So what initially drew me to this book was just kind of the history of the Haenyeo, which I had never heard of before. So basically the Haenyeo on Jeju are female divers, so they free dive and they collect things like octopi and mussels and oysters, things like this that grow around the island of Jeju, and that's really how they provide for their families. So the men of Jeju tend to stay home and tend to the children while the females go dive. And so what I originally heard was that the reason this originally started and kind of spawned this not quite matriarchal but matrilineal female sort of focused society was that men were taxed if they dove in the sea, and so they used the women kind of as a loophole. So the women dove and became the Haenyeo, and then it just became part of the culture. So that was really, really fascinating. And I think there's also another book that's coming out 2021, I believe, called The Mermaid from Jeju, and I think this also focuses on the Haenyeo. Anyway, but I just thought it was very fascinating, and I really loved the Lisa C book that I read earlier in the year, Snowflower and the Secret Fan, which I will link up above here. So I just really wanted to give this one a shot. So actually it was kind of interesting because we started listening to it when I was moving up to Alaska in July, and my mom just wasn't really focusing on it. She just wanted something that was a little bit more engaging. It did have a little bit of a slow start, so we just kind of put it on hold. So I DNF'd it for a few months. And then I sort of came back to it. I was like, you know what, I really want to give this another chance. I want to finish it. So I went back to it. I got back onto the audiobook, and then I was hooked on it shortly thereafter. I would say, like, it's not that nothing happens in the first part because it does get fairly dramatic right away. It's just, I think it just took a little bit to kind of get a good grip on the society and the cultural norms and the characters and just really connect and get into it. But then once you're connected, you're fully invested. So I was listening through all of it, and I used Script for my audiobooks, and I use it pretty regularly. Anyway, so I was using Script, and then the one thing I dislike about it is that sometimes the audiobooks that are available will randomly just like not be available for a while, and it'll happen to like all of their audiobooks. It's usually towards the end of the month, and it doesn't happen every month, but it's just like, this will not be available until 9/1 or whatever, and I'm just like, excuse you, I was in the middle of listening to that. So that happened. I had an hour left of the audiobook, and like it wasn't available one day. So every time you would try and play it, even though I had it downloaded, every time I would try to play it, it would just come up with an error message, which was really frustrating because I was like, I just want to finish this book. So it took, I would say, about a week and a half for it to become available again. I had to listen to the last hour of the audiobook, and I was just like, oh my gosh. So that was a little bit frustrating, but that did not necessarily, like, listening to the book over that long of a period of time, I would say didn't necessarily detract from it, partially because it is a very, very heavy story. Yeah, it's very heavy. There is a lot that happens in it. It's very dramatic, and I'm just gonna go ahead and give you a trigger warning now. The book does deal with a lot of violence. It deals with a lot of, there's some pretty brutal murders and murder scenes, and not just of adults, that were really hard to listen to. There were moments where I just had to turn off the audiobook for a while because I couldn't handle it. There is also some sexual assault content as well. That specifically did not go quite as much into detail as some of the other things, like the murders and the brutality. Oh, there is also like, there's like army and police and just that sort of brutality as well. Yeah, there's a lot happening in this book. Part of it's just the historical era that these characters are living through. There's a lot of traumatic events that happen, and Lisa C does not shy away at it, but I think part of what also makes it very difficult is that she has a very descriptive, visceral sort of writing style. It made it feel all the more real. There's a lot of trauma described in this book in detail, so I definitely don't think it would be a book for everybody. So basically, Lisa C does not shy away from these horrifying descriptions of tragedy that just kind of cut you to the quick. So there were a few, like I mentioned, there were a few specific moments where I just had to stop and pause the audiobook, and I just had to like recollect myself because it was just too much. If you're a very empathetic person, or if you've been through similar events, this may be a triggering book for you. It may not be right. That's okay. There's other books, and I will be touching on some of it in this review. I probably won't be going into detail just because I personally don't want to have to relay a lot of that. But seriously, there's a lot of trauma in this book, and a lot of it is described in detail. So that's your fair warning for this one. I just want to say, despite this, honestly, Lisa C is just top-notch at writing in a profound, beautiful, and visceral way. It is, like I mentioned, a little bit hard to get into at first, but then it just gradually sucks you in, and it's extremely intense, often dark and graphic. But again, it has a lot of really important themes of trauma and resilience and family and friendship and forgiveness that I think is really important. And one thing that the synopsis didn't mention is that this is a time-shifting book. I'm not sure what the technical term is for that style of writing, but it goes back and forth through Young-suk's young life, so from her childhood to her adulthood, and then in 2008 when she is 80-something years old, and she actually is she deals with some of Mija's grandchild and great-grandchild, and they're kind of dealing with stuff in the present. I think it is really, really a good book. Again, not for everyone, and if you think that it might be too much for you to handle, I would say that Snowflower and the Secret Fan might be a little bit easier to start with. There are some fairly graphic depictions of foot binding. There is some other trauma stuff in there, but I would say on the whole it is a lot less intense, a lot less graphic, and just more bearable, at least from my personal perspective, than this one was. I think this one was just a lot heavier and darker overall throughout the entirety of the book. With that, so for my look today, I did want it to be kind of ocean inspired. There wasn't really a lot of beauty trends to pull from that period, especially since it spans such a long historical period. I wanted to go a little more abstract, theoretical with this one. So because so much of the book focuses on the ocean and the sea, I really wanted to pull in with those blues and greens and everything. So that's kind of what I'm going for. And because it's a dark, dramatic book, I'm going to do a little bit of an intense look, or hopefully an intense look, but also a hydrating light base because ocean. I don't know. That's probably as light as this review is gonna get. Gosh. Anyway, so that being said, I'm going to go ahead and put my spoiler warning here. So from this point forward, there will be spoilers. I will keep them kind of fairly general spoilers, so there won't be super duper specifics, but I will talk about the general overarching plot points of the book and, you know, some specifics that I feel are relevant. So going to definitely be mentioning like character deaths, stuff like that is important to the plot, and the development of Mija and Young-suk's friendship. Yeah, so if you want to skip ahead to my final look and thoughts, look at the timestamp down below, and while you're down there, if you wouldn't mind liking, subscribing, commenting, doing all those YouTuber things, that would be awesome. And it helps my channel grow and reach other new bookish friends. Alright, so let's get into our characters. So I'm just going to kind of focus on a few of our sort of main characters, or characters that I thought were kind of dynamic and interesting. Of course, so our main character is Young-suk, so we start with her, we end with her. Mija is our other main character, but I would say basically everything we do is from the perspective of Young-suk, and we really follow her family specifically and her thoughts and feelings. She's interesting because she, you know, of course we view everything through her lens, so we get the most in-depth look at her psyche, and we get to see how her friendship with Mija grows. It kind of shows you how friendship when you're young is so simple and you don't really care about things like, well, why would I care that your family was a Japanese collaborator? You know, why would I care that, you know, you have all of this social history surrounding you that I don't, you know, that doesn't matter to me because I'm a kid. And then as they grow, you start to see how things become more complicated, because it's not just about your individual context, it's also about your context within your larger community, within your larger society, and there's a lot of forces that pull at both of these women throughout their lives. And so you see how their friendship becomes a lot more complicated and how they really fight to keep it. And the tragedy of it is really how you see it deteriorate through a lot of misunderstandings and just a lot of circumstances that couldn't be avoided. You know, it wasn't all misunderstanding. Some of it was legitimately just, there was forces outside of their control that pulled them apart. And a lot of that did have to do with their families, with their upbringing, with who they happen to be. That's part of the tragedy of it. And I would say, you know, the book does end on a hopeful note, but you can really see by kind of going back and forth between 2008 and Young-suk's life, you can really see how her life, her traumas really impacted her and how it sort of did turn her bitter. She holds on to a lot of this anger and frustration and feelings of hurt and betrayal, and they just solidify, and she's like, she does still have joys in her life. And I think that's very realistic, because I think a lot of times when you talk about a character that, you know, has turned bitter, you think about there's no joy in their life at all, or you think there's no love in their life at all. And that's not really the case. She's bitter about very specific things. She still is able to find some happiness and enjoyment from her family, just in life in general, but she has a lot of regrets and a lot of hurts that have really affected her. And, you know, I think that's part of what makes this really well written, because it does take that really complex aspect of human nature. So just that, and then the progression of friendship is really something that Lisa C. focuses on throughout her books, and that's a theme in both Snowflower and the Secret Fin and in this one. Just the progression of friendship, the complications of friendship, how they grow and how they fall apart throughout the lifespan. And then she also shows the aftermath. She shows how older characters sort of deal with that. And I really like that she focuses in on characters who have regrets, characters who make mistakes, because it's very complicated. Like if you go into the Goodreads reviews of this book, it is very split about who they think was in the right and wrong between Young-suk and Mija. It's very split about whether they feel like Young-suk should have forgiven Mija. And I sort of have my own opinions on it, and I recognize that they're kind of formed by my own experiences and bias. You know, everyone's are. I would say that I saw sort of equally split amounts of people who felt that Young-suk was justified in never forgiving Mija, and then people who were really like, well, forgiveness is healing. Forgiveness is, you know, it's good that she finally forgave Mija, which, spoiler, but it takes literal decades. And I think that's another thing, because I think a lot of times forgiveness is viewed as something that happens very quickly, and it doesn't necessarily. It can take years and decades before you finally are able to forgive the hurts that you've been through. And that's just as valid as people who forgive quickly. But I think just seeing Young-suk's progression from very idealistic and hopeful to sort of bitter and closed in certain aspects of her life, like her friendships, but also her progression as just a friend, a wife, a mother, a Haenyeo, is very interesting. And, you know, being a very community focused book, you do focus on the whole community and on Jeju. You focus on the community that the Haenyeo have together. It's not just about one person, it's about the community, it's about the family. So, and then going over to Mija, she's just as complicated as Young-suk is, and there's a lot working against her that I think isn't acknowledged as early on, because when the Japanese were controlling Jeju, being a collaborator in the eyes of the people of Jeju was about as bad as you could get. And then, you know, she had this kind of hanging over her head her whole life about being a collaborator. And so even when she did good, like there were still people who didn't trust her, and it kind of shaped her life in ways that she couldn't control. But there were ways that it helped her, and there were ways that it hurt her. But I think a lot of the tragedy of Mija is just that she didn't have a lot of agency and didn't have a lot of choice in her life, and that wasn't recognized until a lot later. I would say specifically on Young-suk's part. She didn't realize that Mija didn't have a lot of the same choices that she did. She just kind of took it for granted that, well, I accept you, so that means everyone accepts you. Or like other people don't care about your collaborator past. Or, you know, even when it came to their marriage, she really, I think, underestimated a lot of things about Mija's marriage that don't come to light till much, much later in the book. Marriage brings me to Junbu, who is Young-suk's husband, and I adored him. He made me so happy because he was just so sweet. Their marriage was so sweet. They were completely in love. And I think specifically for a historical novel, and specifically for a novel that is so intense and so dark, having that love was really a bright spot in that section of the book. And I think there was also a lot of ways in which he was very modern with his ideas. Like, he talked about how he wanted all of their children to be educated. He wanted all of them to be able to go to school, like daughters and sons, because usually it would be the sons would go to school and the daughters would, on Jeju, would become Haenyeo. And he's like, you know, I want them to have the option to go to school. And Young-suk wasn't sure about this at first. She was like, no, they need to be Haenyeo. And so they had this whole debate, and Junbu was just like, no, I want them to be able to get them, I want to be able to send all of them to school. She's like, how are we going to afford this? Because usually, you know, daughters bring you money because they're able to be Haenyeo. You know, it was interesting to see that sort of dynamic play out, but he was just so hopeful and so idealistic, and he was a teacher, and I think that really came through in a lot of his character, and he was, again, very good at it, and very like, I will protect my family, I will protect my kids, I will teach, I will, you know, help them learn. It was all very, very sweet. I really, really loved Junbu, as long as he was in the story. Sorry, there's a specific, but I thought he was a very, very good addition to the book. I really liked having a marriage that was loving, even though it was arranged. I thought that was really cool. Because a lot of times you sort of focus on the bad side of it, which there is that. Mija's marriage is unfortunately the exact polar opposite of Young-suk and Junbu's. It's very sad. She has an extremely abusive relationship, and her husband is not a good man, to put it bluntly. And she kind of finds herself reliving a lot of her collaborator blood because of her husband's job. He works with the government during a lot of really bad stuff. Oh, and heads up, the US government plays a role in here, and it's not a good one. Makes you understand why a lot of people hate Americans. I'll leave it at that one. But there's also a lot of atrocities committed by other Koreans as well against the people of Jeju. Specifically, during the 4-3 incident, they had a lot of rules that were instated, and this is getting more into plot stuff, but it does play a role because you really see how taxing that is for all of the characters and how it affects them differently, because again, Mija's husband works for the government during all of this, so he's in a privileged position. Even though he, as a person, is terrible, he kind of offers this ring of protection to the people around him, and it doesn't last. But theoretically, he offers this ring of protection. Then there's Junbu, who's, because he's a teacher, he's supposedly one of these radicals. You know, a lot of the teachers were pinned as radical or pinned as communists and stuff like that, and that made teachers, or just people who were educated, a lot more likely to get into trouble, or to be pinned as troublemakers and therefore to be killed. I don't know, a lot of it was just, it was really, really hard to listen to read about. I had trouble with that. And then there's Clara. So Clara is Mija's great-granddaughter. So she's kind of the main driving force in the 2008 portion of the storyline. At this point, Mija has already passed, but she kind of comes to Jeju, and she's American. And sort of brings in this perspective of like, well, sort of Grandma Mija's dying wish for me to like explain things to you and really bring in some healing and some forgiveness. And I just thought she was interesting because even though she's not the largest portion of the story is really going through Young-suk's life, so the 2008 portion isn't nearly as big. But for the portions that she's in, she's really, I think, an interesting character because she's a teenager, so she has a lot of those sort of teenagerisms. I would say sort of stereotypical American teen that Young-suk doesn't really understand. And so seeing them connect is really interesting because Young-suk at first wants absolutely nothing to do with them, and Clara sort of weasels her way into Young-suk's heart. And as the book progresses, you sort of see that progression of Mija and Young-suk's friendship and then its eventual falling out, and how dramatic it was. Like, it was to the point where she didn't ever want to see Mija ever again because their friendship had been so deep. Their falling out was, you know, even deeper. It was a very, very dramatic sort of split, and happened during the 4-3 incident on Jeju. I'm really feeling like this is going to end up being 80s instead of ocean, but we're gonna keep going with it and hope for the best. So that's pretty much all I had for character that isn't directly tied up to the plot. I think that Lisa C is very, very good at creating dynamic characters. Like, no one character is very good or very bad. I would say maybe with the exception in this book of like Jumbu and like Clara, technically, kind of, because she's like a kid. So I would say she does a very good job about making people complex in the way that people are. So you have to actually think about people's individual reasons for doing the things that they did. You can't just say, well, this character was good and this character was bad. You have to actually go like, well, this character went through some major trauma, so I can't, even if I don't understand with where they ended up, I see how they got there, or I see why they made the decisions that they made. So that is, I think, a major plus for this book. It makes it harder to read at certain points, but it makes it very good. It feels like you're reading about real people. So onto the plot. So you start in the present, and you start with her meeting Clara. You start with older Young-suk meeting Clara, and that kind of jump starts her whole sort of reflection on her life, her reflection on how she got to where she is. Personally, it started off a little slow. Like, that doesn't mean it started off not dramatic. It definitely started off dramatic. So it starts off like when she's a kid and when she's a baby diver, and there's actually a diving accident, and Jumbo's sister, Yori, has a diving accident. She's supposed to be watching after our baby diver, which is Young-suk, and she has an accident and it leaves her very injured, and she had some brain damage that affects her the rest of her life. And so it starts off very, very sad. And she was getting ready to go off and get married. Like, there was a lot of things that were supposed to be going well in Yuri's life, and her mother was best friends with Young-suk's mother, you know, so lots of stuff happens. We are kind of introduced to the traditional, like, Korean sort of spiritualism, and a lot of it focuses on the shaman. So there's Shaman Kim, who is this older lady, and she plays a fairly large role throughout a lot of the story because spirituality is very important to the community, and so Shaman Kim is very important. Shaman Kim, she gets like possessed by these different spirits in the book, and so the first one is Yuri, but there's others. And also understanding kind of the societal context of the Haenyeo, understanding what being a Haenyeo means, what their community consists of, seeing really the prejudice that Mija deals with and how Young-suk deals with this as a kid and really just accepts her and is like, no, you're my friend. Duh. Mija has this book that was her father's, and Mija kind of suggests at first that they write in it like all these stuff about their friendship, and Young-suk can't read, so instead they take important pieces of their life and they create rubbings in the book. So you know how, you know, you put something under the page and then you use charcoal to kind of rub over it, so they do that throughout the course of the story, and that actually, it's very symbolic. It plays a big role. It's very, I would say it's very important. It's very touching, I would also say. But yes, so you see how their friendship started and then how it develops. And you also, again, see some of the broader political stuff that's happening. There's an independence rally for Korea, and
that ends up with some arrests and some drama. That was about the point of the book. Like after the independence rally is about where I started to get really invested in it. So like I said, after that is kind of where all the drama and intensity starts in earnest, I would say, because even though Yuri has her accident early on and it's intense, you know, I feel like it's still early on when you're not as connected with the characters. But by the point of the independence rally, you're really starting to get invested in the characters. You're really starting to understand them. So then immediately after this, well, not immediately after this in the book, her mother dies in a diving accident, which that part of the book is definitely extremely sad because it's right after Young-suk catches her first abalone, which is a very important moment in a young Haenyeo's career. And her mom gets caught under the water and she just, like, Young-suk tries to help and she can't, and so she basically just watches as her mother slowly drowns. And it's very sad. The one thing I will say is it didn't seem super realistic to me that no one could get to her to help. Like, that's the one thing I'll kind of say. Like, I was just like, why can't they call anyone? Why can't anyone else help? Like maybe if it was just established a little bit better that everyone else was too spread out, that they, like, there was no way she could signal, no way she could do anything. Maybe. Yeah, that's the one thing I'll say. And one of the few moments in this book that was dramatic that actually took me out, where I was like, that one didn't seem quite as realistic to me, but I understood why it was necessary and why it moved the story along, because it really shapes a lot of Young-suk's interactions and family matters after that. And then you get into, there's a ceremony by Shaman Kim for the funeral, and she has this quote, which again, the sea plays a very large portion because it is the provider for the Haenyeo. And so this quote is, "The sea is better than your natal mother. The sea is forever." And so the sea really comes in, and it's a very large, I would say it's a very large sort of thematic element of the book, because there's ways in which the sea gives and there's ways in which the sea takes away, but it's necessary. Like, you can't escape the necessity of the sea. That quote for me sort of makes the connection to the sea being allegorically connected to friendship and family, to being connected to relationships. That's how you get your nourishment. That's how you get your joy in life, is through relationship with family and friends. But then it can also be very brutal. It can be intense and dangerous, and it can take a lot away from you. Just a matter of figuring out how to navigate those waters. And I think the sea is almost as much of a character throughout this book as the human characters. And then we go back to 2008, and so it talks about how the sea beckons her even as her body is like battered after years of being a Haenyeo. Being a Haenyeo really takes its toll, and again, it's that aspect of like the sea gives, but it also takes in it, you know, in a lot of ways, it sort of takes your health. Really is brutal on these Haenyeo, but they love it. Like, they wouldn't trade it for anything, because in a lot of ways it's their freedom, it's their survival. Again, it beckons her back in, and there's this description of the old bodies. All the Haenyeo at this point are very old, and so there's the description of them getting into their wetsuits, and I thought that was really interesting as well, just focusing in on how they've changed over the years, how the sea combined with age has affected them. Talks about this transition from the traditional Haenyeo clothes into the wet clothes, and there's this quote that goes, "Young-suk's life can be summed up in 3 words, pray, pray, pray." And so there's this kind of combination of the religiosity and the spirituality mixed with the body and the sea. And it's all very, again, all very thematic. At this point in the book, Young-suk really wants to, like, prove she can be as good as she was when she was younger, and she blacks out trying to make a 20-meter free dive and then berates herself after the fact in the ER. And then she gets the bends and has to spend time in a hyperbaric chamber. And then we hop back to 1944. So we're kind of jumping around a little bit. So her adulthood, it gets a lot more tense again, because her 4th brother dies after she turned 16, and so everything is kind of up to Young-suk. She's 21, and she and Mija together, they travel out to do Haenyeo work outside of Jeju. So they do Haenyeo work in China, Japan, and Russia. And then we hop into World War II. Even during World War II, it's really not focused as much on what's happening in the world as it is on what's happening with, you know, Mija and Young-suk kind of being in their prime and at the height of their friendship. They're the closest they've ever been. They have dreams about,
you know, saving money, about their marriages, about, which they're not married quite yet at this point, but they have these like idealistic dreams. Like they taste ice cream for the first time, and that little section's such a little fun description. And then we see this sort of change happening. They meet a boy coming back to Jeju. His name's Sungmoon. Young-suk sort of immediately falls in crush-ish sort of love for him. She's just like, she's head over heels right away, and Mija's acting weird about it, and we find out later it's for good reason. This is sort of the first time where we see a lot of Young-suk's personality is a little bit impulsive. She sort of jumps to conclusions a lot, and Mija, just by her nature, is a little more cautious, but she's not very good at explaining what she's been through, and she's not as good about really opening up. That really, I think, sort of bites them in the butt a little bit. So her first and second brothers and her father were all conscripted into the Japanese army for World War II. And so it's during all of this that they, like I said, meet Sungmoon. Young-suk's grandmother is sort of in charge of setting up marriages. So Young-suk's hoping for Sungmoon, and Mija is still very like ambivalent about all of this, and grandmother wants them to marry at the same time. And I even made a note, I'm like, Young-suk likes this guy way too fast. I don't trust him. Mija and I don't trust him. We had good reason. He's a terrible human. And at least Young-suk at some point recognizes like how fast the crush was, like how much was like kind of really stupid how quickly she fell for him, and was kind of willing to like assume the worst about Mija, who has been her best friend literally since she was like, what, 8 years old, and she's sort of willing to like throw a lot of it away for a boy she like barely knows. I was kind of mad at Young-suk at this portion of the book. I was just like, girl, what are you doing? Mija like begged Young-suk's grandmother not to let her marry Sungmoon. Grandmother's disgusted with the father, and then marries Mija to him anyway, and then it comes out like he groped Mija that first day, and she was like basically too scared to tell Young-suk about it. And then even later we find out, and this is like way later in the book, like at the very end of the book, you kind of find out that he didn't just grope her, he raped her, and for basically the entirety of their marriage he physically abused her, like heavily. And Young-suk's like, well, why didn't you tell me? And it's like, there's kind of some victim blaming going on in there on Young-suk's part, and part of it was just, like, part of it was also just like, well, why didn't she tell me? She was my best friend, and da-da-da-da-da. And like not really being able to understand Mija at all, or understand her predicaments at all. Like she really, again, sort of kicks me off in different places. And even though it's realistic, like I don't think any of this is necessarily unrealistic, because I think a lot of it is accurate to how people deal with close friends, close family being in these sort of situations, but it's still really hard to like sort of listen to and realize that, you know, she maybe wouldn't be as supportive as they hoped. Like, it's just, it's hard. Like I said, this is revealed over the course of the book. I'm trying to sum it up for a review, but there's a lot of traumatic stuff that Mija goes through that she doesn't really tell Young-suk about. Partially because she doesn't want to burden her, partially because she's scared. Once they have children, she's very scared for her son, for his life, and that's another part of the reason. But then at this point she gets married to Junbu, who's Yuri's brother, and they grow to love each other really quickly, and that part is really sweet. But then it's kind of contrasted against Mija, who's obviously getting more and more miserable. And Junbu goes back to Osaka to finish school, and Sungmoon goes away too, and so then you get this kind of brief reprieve where Mija and Young-suk are Haenyeo together again. Most of the women discover they're pregnant, they have their babies on the boat. I think they're in Russia. They still dive, they go right back to work, and I'm just like, oh my gosh. Mija has a son, Young-suk has a daughter, then Young-suk has another son, and we have the end of World War II and the dividing of Korea. And so Jeju becomes a stepping block for the Americans, and they're based there, and they recruit mainlanders as police to put down insurgents. This is where we started to get a lot of the intense stuff of the book. Young-suk has another baby, and things get bad so fast. I'm not even kidding. Like, I want to say in the course of like a chapter or two, everything goes to absolute crap. It is so intense. There's murders. They set up what they call the Ring of Fire. So basically, no one can be more than 5 miles inland on this island, and they call it the Ring of Fire, and they have a scorched earth policy. And it's largely by the mainlanders that the mainland Koreans, that they
had as police, but the Americans were implicit in a lot of it because they sort of didn't care what the mainland police did. They just kind of let it happen. There was no reprieve and a ton of people died. At this point, I really started to appreciate Jeonbu. I appreciated how hard he worked. I loved him. He's a little feminist. He wants his daughters to go to school just like his sons will. He fights really hard to educate people, to protect people, and still tries to remain very idealistic and optimistic. And then there's the hardest part of the book for me to get to, and again, major trigger warning for this section of the book. It is so intense. It is so, I feel like I can't emphasize enough how hard this was for me to get through because it was just so intense and violent and gruesome. There's 2 soldiers that die randomly in their town overnight. The elders of the village try to take them back to the base and plead the town's innocence. All of the elders are killed. There is a bloody massacre. During this massacre, Jeonbu, Young-suk's oldest son, Sun-suk, and Yuri are all very brutally murdered. I am not going to go into details about the murders, but this is the section of the book where I felt nauseous. I wanted to throw up. I almost had to stop listening. I was like, can I make it through the rest of this book? It was that intense. It was so gruesome, and I was like, I don't think I cried so much as I was just so overwhelmed I had to stop. I knew, like, I felt so much of this. This is also sort of the pinnacle moment in what eventually leads to Mija's and Young-suk's friendship, like its downfall, because Young-suk views this moment as a betrayal from Mija. This is just the really intense part of the book. What becomes the downfall of Mija and Young-suk's relationship, because Sunmoo works for the government, so Mija has protection. Basically, she's not going to be killed. Like if she steps up and says, you know, who her husband is, she will not be killed. And Young-suk like pleads with her to like take her children, like get them out of there so they won't be killed. Like they're all being held in this one spot basically. Mija says she can't take the children, and then she thinks about it and she's like, maybe I can take one, can you choose one? Young-suk kind of has to try and choose between her children. It's very intense, and she's like, how can I choose between my children? But she's trying because she just wants it. And then Mija's like, actually I can't take any of them. And she doesn't help as much when Sunmoon arrives, and she walks away. Because I mean, originally she was like sitting, she didn't announce herself when they said, like basically any collaborators, or I can't remember the words they used, but like anyone who works for the government, please stand up and go away. And originally Mija didn't. She's like, we're in it till the end, and then she shifts. You can see the shift in her when her husband arrives. But Young-suk is just so focused on all of this trauma that she just witnessed, because again, her sister-in-law husband and her son, who's a toddler, just got brutally murdered. So she's understandably not doing the best mentally at that place in time, and so she shifts pretty much all of the blame for the entirety of the situation onto Mija's shoulders. Like, she realizes that it's not entirely Mija's fault, but she still basically blames Mija for everything. And a lot of her feelings are very understandable, but you can kind of see where the logic was and where the logic wasn't. That section is incredibly hard to go through, and then they end up calling the village of widows because so many of the men were killed. Young-suk basically goes to live with her mother-in-law, and she's a very present part of the book, and she's the chief of the diving collective at that point in time. And Mija moves and goes to a different collective. Like, she moves away for a time and then she comes back. At that point, Young-suk discovers she's pregnant, so that, like, Jeonbu's like last gift to her was another baby. When she has a daughter, like I said, Young-suk escaped back to Hado, which is her natal home, and lives with her mother-in-law. And she wanted to die for a while, and then she basically decided, I would love because I could not die. Yeah, and they end up choosing one of the minor characters. There's like these twins named Kuja and Kusan, but Kuja is chosen as chief over Young-suk because basically Kuja was less traumatized than Young-suk, and they're like, we don't know if we can trust Young-suk to be as stable as chief, which is just another blow on top of all of it. And then we go back to 2008, and they actually establish a peace memorial, like sort of in honor of the victims of the 4/3 incident. It's not just that one massacre, but it's like all of the tragedies that happened on the island. There's just some talking about how everything is kind of swept under the rug. Like, they kind of just want to move on without really acknowledging all of the trauma and hurts that so many of the people went through, which I thought was very relevant because I think that's a very common reaction by the larger population. They're like, they don't really want to acknowledge a lot of these tragedies that have happened and were perpetuated by their own people, because a lot of these atrocities were really committed, like, even though they were allowed by the Americans, and it doesn't in any way detract from what the Americans did. Like, a lot of the individual atrocities were perpetuated by Koreans, by their own countrymen. And so that made it a lot easier for them to say, it's easier if we just move on. But you really see how that hurts the people who did have to live through those events, because it's like, okay, you can say we can sweep it under the rug, but I still experienced this. I still have trauma from this. And Young-suk at this point just wants to be left alone, and she tries not to be better, but she realizes she still is. And then Clara follows her and is kind of like trying to talk to her, and she's still not entirely sure about it. Then we go back to the past. Chun-li, who is the youngest of Young-suk's children, is very adorable. She wants to be a little scientist. I love her. The scientists come to Jeju. They want to study the Haenyeo because they're very unique. And Chun-li, again, she's a little scientist. She's so excited. She loves school. And so Young-suk kind of draws a lot of parallels between Jungbu and Chun-li. And Jungbu was such an academic. He was so adamant that he wanted his children to get an education, and so it's really easy for Young-suk to draw a lot of these connections. So she really works hard to give Chun-li a good life, to give Chun-li the opportunities that she didn't have. It's really interesting to watch how she works so hard for her children. And so her oldest daughter is best friends with a girl named Young-sun, and who is Kuja's daughter or Kusan's? I can't remember. One of the two. She gets swept out to sea in an accident, and there's rumors going around that she was potentially pregnant with Mija's son's child. Like, maybe she wanted to die, but she's swept out to sea and she dies. So they have this funeral. Shaman Kim goes into sort of the possessed state. I don't know the correct term, but instead of Young-sun showing up, like, Yori shows up and Jungbu shows up and Sung-soo shows up, and like, it's so dramatic and powerful. And that was the part of the book where I cried, because I was typing in all caps in my notes. I was just like, this is not chill, this is so sad. They're talking about, like, it's crowded in this grave. I was innocent. They killed me, but I have found forgiveness. And there's this very bittersweetness to it, because it's been literal years. Young-suk has been waiting for all of these years to hear something from her family that was murdered. And, like, it doesn't happen until this moment. And Mija shows up at the funeral and she's mad. And both women pulled very different meanings from the messages from Yori and Jungbu and Sung-soo. And then they talk about them being, like, together in death and da-da-da-da. There's so much to go through in this. Oh my gosh. It's just like, this is gonna be a long book, look, I just know it. But there's so much happening. I mean, it's a long book, but there's also just, like, so much jam-packed. Like, it's not, like, once it picks up, it really gets going. Like, it doesn't stop. There's a lot that happens in Young-suk's lifetime. Kuja and Kusan are obviously deeply affected by their daughter/niece's deaths. Oh yeah, Kuja steps down and Kusan immediately nominates Young-suk because she's lost, and so Young-suk becomes chief. But Kusan still dives with Kuja, and so a lot of Young-suk's journey to forgiveness sort of is paralleled by Kusan's. She's mad at her sister, but she sort of has to find forgiveness, because this is her sister, this is her family. Like, it's not necessarily her fault that Young-suk died, or that Young-soon died, but, like, there's a lot of parallels between their journey and Mija and Young-suk's journey. So there's a lot of, like, kind of familial stuff, specifically between Chun-li and Young-suk. Chun-li she is very academically focused. Young-suk sacrificed a lot. You know, she's a single mother at this point. She's working extremely hard to try and put her children through school. She sacrifices so she can go to boarding school, then eventually to university, and she and Young-chun, who is Mija's son, end up meeting at the same university on the Korean mainland. Anyway, they end up getting married, and Young-suk cannot forgive. Mija tries to, like, smooth things out between the two of them. They have this kind of heart-to-heart conversation, but Young-suk she cannot get past what happened during the massacre. Chun-li and Young-chun are married, and Young-suk never sees them again, and she sends, like, letters and stuff. And Young-suk's oldest daughter kind of tries to convince her to forgive, like for Chun-Li's sake. She kind of tries, but she just can't do it. And even after like she has her first baby, she again just cannot do it. And that part is really sad because you can really see how it hurt her to hold on to this bitterness against Mija. Like, it hurt her family, it hurt her relationship with her daughter. She never saw her again because she died quite young. And again, that's just really sad. It was, oh my gosh, that was hard to read. I was just like, you can understand her anger at Mija, but like she extended it to being mad at her daughter, and being mad at her daughter for kind of like choosing Mija's son over her. Even when others try to convince her, like, you should at least go see your grandchild, you should at least go try to be civil for Chun-Li's sake. Like, she just can't do it. A level of understanding to it, like, you understand why she's so hurt, but you can also see where I personally was like, just like, for your daughter's sake, like, try for your daughter's sake. Like, she's, you know, it's not her fault in all of this, but there you can see that's the difference between you and the character. But there's just a lot of tragedies to me in the fact that she's never able to see her daughter again. And then you go back to present day. Young-suk pulls out the letters from Chun-Li, and we don't know at first about Chun-Li and Yuan-chun, but that means that technically speaking, Clara is also her great-granddaughter, and her mother is her granddaughter. So, like, this is something that's not revealed until towards the end of the book, and it's such a, for me, that was just like, that was also a heartbreaking moment, because it was like, there's so much that has been lost because of this one moment in time that wasn't entirely either of their faults, but just the way it sort of played out just was the worst in every way. But Clara and Janet, Janet is Clara's mom, they come and they let her listen to Mija on tape, because Clara basically started as a project for school interviewing Mija, and Mija told her kind of her life story, and then she talked about everything about her life, and she's like, I'm really gonna be open and honest and, you know, actually speak openly about what happened to me, why I did the things I did. And that's when stuff finally comes out about how bad and abusive her relationship with someone really was. He beat her all the time. He beat Young-chun. She didn't want to take Young-suk's children during the massacre because she was afraid that he'd beat them too, or she knew she'd beat them too. And then she was so focused on just staying alive for her son because she was like, who knows what would happen to her son if she died, kind of thing. And so she was kind of trying to explain a lot of that. And after all of this happens, after she finally hears Mija on tape, Young-suk decides that she's finally ready to forgive, and she will teach her granddaughter and her great-granddaughter to dive. And one thing I hadn't quite touched on yet was the Haenyeo, when they go diving, they take a breath, a breath, a breath, and then they dive. So the last line of the novel is a breath, a breath, a breath. And I thought that was like a really good full circle moment to sort of pull everything together. And like Young-suk's really trying, like she knows it's too late for her to make up with Mija, but she's like, for the sake of my family, you know, this is my family too. And because she was never able to make up with Chun-Li before she died, she was like, I'm going to do this. And I thought that it was really poignant that, you know, she didn't necessarily have to state all of that. It was all in the actions. It was in how she decided, I'm going to teach them to swim. Like, I'm going to show them our heritage, show them my life, because her life has been the sea. Her life is so completely interconnected with the sea and with being a Haenyeo. And I thought that was a really good way to end it. Alright, I am going to go ahead and finish my look, and then we'll come back for the final look and thoughts.
Alright, so this is the final look. Alright, so I realized I didn't at the beginning, I talked a little bit about how I wanted this to be a little more abstract and ocean focused, but I also, like, I forgot to mention, like, I also wanted to give myself a little bit more of a bronzed tan look, so if I can tan. But because a lot of the novel, because Lisa C is very descriptive and she focuses in on how the sea sort of affected the bodies of the Haenyeo and talked about how, you know, their skin is very tanned and very tough because they spend so much of their lives outdoors and, you know, affected by the salt of the sea and everything. So I obviously didn't go to too many extremes, but I did add a little bit more bronze than normal, and also added it a little bit higher on my cheeks so it gave more of that I've been out in the sun look, which in actuality, if I'm out in the sun, I just sunburn. But we'll pretend for the sake of this look that I actually can tan, and just a little bit more glowy. It ended up a little bit more matte than I planned, but ah well. I tried. There wasn't too much else. Tried to do very intense blue oceany look for the eyes, so focusing in on the different shades of blue, and I tried to look up specifically like photos of Jeju and like the sea around it. So, you know, of course, close to the coast, there's more of the turquoisey sort of look, and then it very quickly goes out into that deep oceany blue. So I just tried to capture all of the different types of blue and the dimensions of blue in my eyes. So that's all I have to say about the look. My final thoughts on the book. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a very intense book. It is a very deep book. There's a lot of complexities to it, and it has to do a lot with friendship and family and forgiveness. And I think forgiveness is kind of the biggest theme, focusing in on, you know, both what forgiveness can do for you and what a lack of forgiveness can do for you. I don't think you're supposed to walk away going for certain that Young-suk should have forgiven faster. I don't think that's supposed to be what you walk away with. I think you're supposed to walk away with the knowledge of how complex it is, how hard friendship is, and how hard life can be. A lot of this focuses in on how circumstances affect friendships and affect your relationships. And you can't necessarily change a lot of that. But because it's discussed so much, forgiveness is very much a central theme of this book, and talking about how hard it is to forgive, how forgiveness isn't necessarily a one-time fix. It's not something you can just go, oh, I forgive this, and then everything magically changes. It's very much a process. It's something you have to think about a lot, and it can be something that's very, very difficult, especially if the hurt is very deep and dramatic. There's also themes of just the change of time. There's themes of environmentalism. There's themes of, you know, what it takes to be a parent and how hard that can be. And, you know, there's so much more I could go into. And I realized that you know, in my plot section, I went into a lot of detail, but I didn't even cover half of the stuff that is fit into this book. It is so complex and rich and deep. I feel like I barely scratched the surface in going into it. I think there's a lot of value you can get from this book. I think there's a lot of very good commentary on history and on human nature that can be found in it. It's one of my definite 5-star reads of 2020. And I tend not to use the star system so much. I feel like it's kind of thrust upon you. You know, you're kind of forced to think numerically, where does this book fit? But that was very much one, and I wouldn't say so much because I enjoyed the reading experience, because again, there were moments where I very much was not enjoying myself. like I mentioned, there were moments where I had to stop because it was just too much. But it's a very deep read. It's something that will make you think, and you should come away thinking from this book, because there's no right or wrong answer. There's nothing black and white about this book. You have to really think about the complexities. I think a lot of it comes down to Lisa C's absolute talent and force as a writer. She is so good. She is extremely good at, I would say, cutting to the quick of like human experience and human emotion, and really helping you see things through the character's viewpoint, even when you recognize cognitively that the character is wrong. So like, there are moments where Young-suk definitely makes mistakes, or Mija definitely makes mistakes, and you're like, that was not a good choice. But you understand them, you understand why they did it, you understand the state of mind and the state of heart they were in, and Lisa C is so good at just immersing you in a world, in a culture, in a person. And I think that that is a very
hard thing to do as a writer. Not only that, but she's just a very descriptive author. Her prose is beautiful. The way she describes the world is beautiful. And I think the word I've used multiple times for her is visceral, because it feels very real. It's very easy to get immersed in her world, which is part of why some of the sections are so hard to get through. Some of them are so intense and so dark and so gruesome because she's so good at description and so good at explaining exactly what is happening. Like, she doesn't even necessarily have to go into a great amount of detail about the specific things that are happening, like specifically about some of the triggering stuff. Even when she chooses not to describe it in detail, sometimes she does and sometimes she doesn't, you feel so deeply what the characters are feeling that it still feels visceral. It's still described in such a way that you connect emotionally to it. And so for that reason, I recommend this book, but I don't recommend it lightly. I think it's a book that you have to understand what you're getting it for. You have to sort of take it in chunks. You have to digest all of the very heavy themes and history that you're partaking in. A lot. It's a journey. But I think it's a very good one. I think it will help you sort of see things through a different lens. And it is a very different culture than us as Americans. Specifically, if you come from a more European background, so like I do, it's very different. But it's a good different. It's very eye-opening in a lot of ways. So I do definitely recommend it. But I think you, again, have to be prepared for what you're getting in for, because it is a very big, heavy book. If you're looking for a light, fluffy read, this is not for you. This is not what you're looking for. Go find something else. But if you want something that will really make you think and possibly make you cry and feel nauseous at certain points, but in a good way, this book is for you. Alright, so that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have an absolutely beautiful day. Stay magic, keep reading. I love you all so much. Goodbye!